Hey everyone! In today's episode, we've got Yumu Almdar, and today's one of our monthly threat report episodes. So we've got a lot to talk about in this episode. We've got all of our email security statistics we're going to be talking about, and we're also going to provide some commentary on the recent Microsoft breach involving 38 terabytes of data. We're also going to give the latest on the Storm 0558 situation, and we're going to talk about the vulnerability in libwebp, which is the library that's used for encoding and decoding images out on the internet and affects countless applications out there. So that and lots more coming up on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. All right, everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insights straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Sirwich, and I've got Yumu Almdar back on the show today to kind of talk to us about the findings of our most recent monthly threat report. How's it going, Yumu?
Thanks for having me, Andy. I'm fine.
Hey, it's always good having you. You know, being head of security labs like you are at Hornet Security here, you are always a wealth of knowledge and information. And I swear, every time I have you on the show, I learn something new from you every time, you know, and I know we talk a lot because you're my direct report, but I feel like we get into these conversations and there's always so much to learn when I have you on the show. So appreciate you being here. So again, we're kind of covering the findings of our most recent monthly threat report. So the data period here for this particular version of the report is from basically for the month of September is the data period, right? And we do this every month here at Hornet Security, and it's basically this exercise allows us to keep our eyes on the threat landscape for email security, M365 security. We also look at news trends in the security space, provide some commentary, some recommendations. All around, it's a fantastic piece of content, and I will include a link to that document in the show notes, either below or to the side, depending on your platform. Be on the lookout for that. But I figure we just kind of start stepping through the bullet points here. What do you think? Should we get started?
Sure, let's go.
So the first thing that we notice that kind of stands out here is that by and large, when we compare this data period with the previous data period, email threats remained at nearly the same level as previous months. And when we do that, we have all of our different classifications within our email security solutions, right? And the two ones that I always look at when I'm kind of digesting these findings are those emails that we categorize as threats and those emails that we categorize as advanced threats, right? And we saw that they basically stayed at the same level, which they're at a fairly high level right now. So the high persistent threats from last month in terms of email security kind of remain the same this month. What are your thoughts on that, Yumu?
Absolutely, you described it well already. What we have to keep in mind is that we are in September, so people are coming back from their vacations, and doing that, we see a lot more active clients, meaning more compromised systems go back online. We see overall the distribution remains the same, but nonetheless the level of phishing emails, for example, increases, and it's still at an alarming level.
Right. And I think that's the key point, especially as we start moving into the holiday season as well, too, right? Mm-hmm. And you and I have talked about that recently, how once we start getting closer to the holiday season, well, the levels start getting a little bit worse than they were throughout the rest of the year. So we'll certainly be on the lookout for that as we get it closer to those holiday months. So the next key data point that we always look at as part of this report is what types of files are being used to deliver malicious payloads. So when we think about in terms of email security, those would be your attachments, right? So HTML files have been the number one offender for I want to say at least 2 months, I think 3 months. Don't quote me on that because my memory's not great, but it's been at least 2 months. That said, we did see a reduction in the use of HTML files, while we then saw an increase in the usage of PDFs and archive files. Now, there's a reason that we've identified for the increase in PDF usage. And I'll let you go into that, Yumu, if you've got a second to you're here, so I'm assuming you have a second. But yeah, why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. Before digging into the PDF files, what we have to keep in mind is that attackers quite often use these common file types because they are supported by many operating systems. So we use HTML files on a day-to-day basis. It can be rendered by all web browsers using Firefox, Chrome, Edge, and so on. Because of that, attackers use that file format. The same applies to PDF. So nowadays, every web browser can use it. Some years ago, we had dedicated PDF readers installed on our clients, but now even Firefox and Chrome can render PDF documents. Why did the usage of PDF increase? We saw the context to the Darkgate malware. So the Darkgate malware is comparable to for example, the Quackbot malware. It nests into the client. It can steal secrets from the client's machine. It can also install advanced malware to the client once it got infected. And it allows the attacker to exfiltrate lots of files also from the client. Just a side note on Darkgate, what we also saw in September is that the group behind it also targeted users not only through email, but also by Microsoft Teams messages. Through that, they distributed also PDF documents, but also nested PDF documents into archive files. So we really need to keep that in mind going forward. Darkgate could have the potential to be one of the contenders for the top malware of 2023.
And we kind of made the point, I think, in last month's version of this particular episode, when QuakeBot was disrupted, right, by all the large U.S. Law enforcement agencies. We kind of had that question like, okay, well, those threat actors are going to go somewhere. They're not going to just hang up their hat and be like, well, QuakeBot's gone. I guess I'm done hacking now, right? They're not going to do that. So what are they going to use next? And I think it's probably a little bit early to say that Darkgate is the new QuakeBot, but it certainly has seen an uptick in the last month, right?
Absolutely.
So it's going to be interesting to see where that one goes as the weeks and months roll along. So we'll be sure to keep an eye on that, and we'll continue to report back on that as we do future monthly reports. So the next area that we look at in terms of this report is what industry verticals are the most targeted. And not much of a change here on this particular data point between this month and the previous data period, in that the top two targeted industries were the entertainment and mining verticals, which, entertainment, I think entertainment, and I'm instantly thinking of like the MGM situation that occurred some weeks ago, right? So I always think anytime there's gambling or things of that nature, they become ripe for targeting because there's money involved, right? And that's kind of the same thing in the mining space I see too, where it's probably a small subset of companies in that space, but when you were talking about precious metals, there's a lot of money to be had inside of that vertical, right? So other things to note regarding this, if I dig a little bit further down into this particular data point, is even though those two remain the top two, we did see a noticeable increase in the amount of threats being sent at research organizations, manufacturing organizations, and the transport industry as well, too. So kind of some interesting data there, to look at and digest. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on any of those data points, Yumu?
Yeah, so you mentioned already, so research and manufacturing are being targeted more and more. I believe when we look back at the year, especially with a sight on also recent AI developments on robotics and so on, I believe that this trend will go on also in the following months. I mean, when did ChatGPT become mainstream? It was at the end of last year, I believe. In December it got published, and in the recent 10 months, humanity developed super fast, and we don't know what happens behind the curtains right now in the industry in regards to AI and research, AI and robotics and so on. We have seen a glimpse of it already. I mean, you may have also seen the videos from the Disney Fair and how they developed most recent robotics and so on, which can interact with children even. And I think these industry sectors are super interesting for attackers for espionage reasons because of that. So right now, behind the curtains, there may be a lot of going on, super interesting stuff that we are going to see in the following months. However, if you have access to this information now, you may be able to develop your own product faster or help your own industry faster.
Right. It's definitely going to be an interesting space to watch. One thing you and I have talked about before previously is the whole idea behind a threat actor poisoning a generative AI's responses, right? And I just think about all the mischief that could be gotten into from that style of attack, misinformation or redirecting the user to a malicious URL, or it's going to be interesting to see how that style of attack evolves as generative AI continues to get more ingrained in our society, right?
Absolutely. So it's not only about espionage, but also sabotage
right.
as a whole, right? So you can also halt the specific industry within the country if you keep attacking it.
Yep. It's going to be interesting to see, definitely. All right. The next data point we have centers around brand impersonation. So you think about those phishing emails that your organization gets targeted with, right? And we always look and see, okay, what company brands are being used most frequently in those types of phishing emails, right? And DHL has been the #1 most impersonated brand for some time, a couple months at least. That said, we saw a noted increase in Netflix, FedEx, DocuSign, and T-Mobile as well. So lots to unpack here, right? So I want to start by talking about DHL and FedEx because they're both shipping companies. I'm never surprised when I see shipping companies on the list just because I always use myself as an example. My wife loves to buy stuff online, and we've got something showing up at the house probably 3 to 4 days of the week, right? So if a threat actor lands a very cleverly crafted FedEx shipping phishing message in my inbox at just the right time, I'm quite likely to, not me personally, because I know to look for this type of stuff, but your average user, my mother probably would, interact with it, right? So yeah, I don't think there's any surprises there. Anything you would add to that, Yumu?
No, I mean, this will increase in the coming months when people start ordering their Christmas presents and so on, or when Black Friday more or less knocks on the door and we expect more packages.
Right.
With that comes the DHL, FedEx phishing emails.
Yep, and it's funny how threat actors, they follow trends, right? Which brings me to Netflix. And maybe it's not necessarily a trend that we see on a yearly basis, but Netflix has recently had a number of policy changes, a number of pricing changes, right? I think you mentioned that just before the show. But I see threat actors capitalizing on those announcements because there's going to be emails, there's going to be communication involved with that, legitimate communication from Netflix. Threat actors are going to try to capitalize and sneak their own messages in under the hood on that, right? And anytime I look at Netflix, I'm like, okay, if I'm a threat actor, what am I going to do with Netflix credentials, right? So, it's like, okay, yeah, I could get some payment details from the account. I'm going to get the last 4 of the credit card number. I'm going to get address, phone number. I'm going to get some usable information, but not everything I need to use that payment method, most likely. Now, that said, I could also see threat actors wanting to resell the Netflix accounts, right? Or more likely, in my assumption, to try and reuse those credentials in credential stuffing attacks. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I totally agree with you. And we have seen the news around Netflix in the mainstream media regarding policy changes, pricing changes. And some days ago, I received a message from Spotify for something comparably. So in Germany, they start to increase the price for the premium plan. We may see this now also in October coming up, phishing emails regarding Spotify. This is a trend that we have seen also in previous trendy topics, I would say. For example, COVID COVID has also been utilized for phishing attacks, for fraud attacks with emails and so on. Obviously, it's a different segment or a different category of attack because COVID was wide-reaching. Netflix is more or less regarding your entertainment account, but nonetheless, attackers see trends in the main media and then jump on it to more or less use the context that you also describe for FedEx, right? So you always expect a package at home.
Right.
And people may expect this email coming from Netflix because they've read about the policy change in the news. So because of that, the success of the phishing attack may be there.
Yep. Yeah, interesting times, right? So, which brings us to the next company, DocuSign. Now, DocuSign, it never surprised me when I see DocuSign on the list because the example I always use here in the States is whenever you purchase a house in the U.S., there's a billion forms to sign when you're buying a house, and DocuSign seems to be used quite a lot. So it's always used for those very sensitive type of transactions. And, you know, when I'm doing something like buying a house, I'm expecting to see stuff from DocuSign, right? So again, kind of that clever targeting, that trying to get that malicious email in the guise of something that's legitimate, right? But I would think what's interesting, what we found with the DocuSign brand impersonation this month, is we've seen a couple of different variants of it. So we saw one variant that was just literally a static image with a malicious URL behind it. We saw another variant where it had been crafted using HTML, so it actually looked like a legit, very legit DocuSign email. Same thing, malicious URL behind the button this time. And then, strangely enough, we also saw a specific variant of it that was targeting the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Not the department itself, but those people here in the U.S., war vets typically, that are utilizing the services of the VA, as we call it here in the U.S. And that, I saw that, and it kind of made me think of a couple of things. So my wife is a librarian here in the States, and they have a lot of veterans come in and utilize computer services in the library. And multiple times she has caught veterans who are typically older, are not as tech savvy as us younger folks, right? She's caught them multiple times in the process of actively being scammed by an email like this, right? And so I actually showed her the screenshot, and the screenshot is in the report. Again, check out the link in the description for that. But I showed it to her, and I'm like, okay, you know, your typical veteran that comes into the library, are they going to be able to see that this is not a legitimate DocuSign message? And I forget exactly what it's targeted, but it's something about accessing their benefits, right? I mean, if I was a war vet and, you know, I don't have my own PC at home and I'm just trying to access my benefits, I'm annoyed by technology, as a generalization. Not all war vets are annoyed by technology. But I just find it interesting that they're trying to take advantage of that subset of the U.S. population, right? So just my thoughts. Anything you want to add on that, Yumu?
Yeah, what we have to keep in mind is also the more or less what a click on at these links in the DocuSign emails lead to. So some variants, so you describe 3 variants, some variants actually lead to the download of PDF documents that contain malicious code. Other variants lead to actual DocuSign landing pages. Obviously, these are phishing sites, and the attackers are after your credentials. What we have to keep in mind is that once the attacker has your credential through DocuSign, they can also look into the other documents that you signed in the past. And this can then help them steal your identity. They can read your addresses in the other documents that are stored within your DocuSign. If you're unlucky, you also have a copy of your ID stored in DocuSign in previous documents that you needed to sign, for example. So this gives the attackers more room for subsequent attacks. For example, using the data they harvested from DocuSign, they could contact your bank, make some changes in your name and so on, or your telecommunication provider, do some SIM swapping attacks, or change your passwords to other kinds of email accounts and so on. So this is quite dangerous. So DocuSign, users really need to be trained on DocuSign phishing attacks, because the impact of having your DocuSign account phished is a disaster.
Oh, for sure. And we actually put that in our recommendations in this month's report. Like, hey, if you've got users in your organization that actively use DocuSign, which I'm going to guess most organizations do, at least take the time to make sure those users that use it most frequently are aware of these types of attacks. Because at an individual level, it's terrible, right, to be a victim of that style attack. But I'm thinking, like, if I'm an organization, that's in my DocuSign account, and everything that I've got about my organization contained in DocuSign gets compromised. I mean, that's like Armageddon, right? That's not great. So, well, we got a couple minutes left here, and we have 3 other data points to get to. The first one I want to talk about, and this seems to be a recurring trend lately, and we actually did a podcast. Our friend Paul Schnackenberg and I did a podcast episode on this particular topic. Microsoft continues to have security issues. And the Storm 0558 one is the big one recently, right? That's probably going to go down as the biggest Microsoft security issue of the year, if not the last couple of years. But there's been yet another one, which really brings into question their security culture, right? And I know that's not what we're talking about in this particular episode. Maybe we'll talk about that in a future episode. But the point here is there's been yet another breach, this time involving... I got a link to it in the show notes if you want to read the entire attack chain. But what it comes down to is that there was an improperly secured blob storage account where the threat actors were able to pull out the personal backups of 2 Microsoft employees. Contained in the backups, which totaled 38 terabytes of data, contained in those backups were passwords, keys, other secrets, the personal Teams chat messages of a bunch of internal Microsoft staff. I want to say it was north of 30,000 messages, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that. But if I'm a threat actor, I mean, there's a lot that I could do with the information contained in there, right? And I find it interesting, Microsoft's response to this. If you actually go out and look at their official, post-mortem documents, right? They're like, oh, we mitigated a threat, right? That was like their stance. We mitigated a threat. And the one that really, the phrase that really sticks with me in this particular announcement of theirs is, we found excessively permissive permissions. Now, Paul and I were talking about this. Like, how would we normally talk about that? Normally, we would say, okay, yeah, we messed up bad. The permissions were misconfigured. But lawyers speak, they were excessively permissive permissions. I think it's I don't know if it's funny, but it's definitely, you could tell legal had gotten their hands on this announcement. Anyway, I know you and I have talked about the Microsoft thing for a while, but any thoughts over what I've mentioned so far, Yuma?
Yeah, I think the shocking part is the size of the data storage that got leaked, right? So it was 38 terabytes of data. I don't think that I accumulated that much data in the recent 10 years at home security on my clients, and these were just backups from two AI engineers at Microsoft, I believe. So it's really a lot of data that I think Microsoft tried or actually planned to use for open source AI learning models or something like that, I believe. I don't know the exact context, but I think the news media reported on this, and Microsoft also said some words on this more or less. The size is just shocking, right? And just like maybe you remember back then when the Panama Papers got released, regarding lots of documents, and then people started to go through these papers, and it took them some months to go through it. I believe things like that will also happen with the 38 terabytes of data here, so that maybe if someone got their hands on the data storage, they may try to connect the data and then find new ways to attack some Microsoft services, as we've seen previously with the signing key incident some weeks ago. So maybe things like this will come up again, because attackers can actually read internals, right? So as you mentioned, there were over 30,000 internal Microsoft Teams messages, and I believe some of them could also be from the engineering teams.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I know Microsoft's a huge organization, but I can't believe for a second that they won't find something that will be of use to them in there, right? And I mean, at the very least, it gives them insight into how Microsoft operates as an organization, gives them organizational information, potential information on services, you know, stuff that's not meant for the public eye. It's, at the very least, it's a horrible look at Microsoft, who already has a bruised nose from the whole Storm 0558 issue, right? So, which I guess makes sense to talk about that one before we get into our final points. So I guess we'll skip ahead to the Storm 0558 breach. And in our report this month, we just provided a quick update on this situation. Now, for those that aren't aware, you can go look at last month's report where we detailed this. I've included links in this month's report to that, so you can go kind of get a rundown on the attack. Essentially, what it boils down to is that Chinese nation-state threat actors were able to procure a consumer signing key and then use that to forge their own authentication tokens into Microsoft Cloud services. Now, one of the big organizations, and the organization that actually notified Microsoft of this issue initially, was the U.S. State Department. And I've been waiting to see kind of what the blast radius of this particular breach has been going to be, and we kind of have a little bit of an idea now, because initially Microsoft had just said, hey, there were approximately 25 organizations that were impacted. Now the State Department is saying, okay, we had 60,000 emails that were exfiltrated, and the full list of department email addresses as well too. So a couple of things from my perspective on that. One, the email list by itself is pretty scary to think about, because now the attackers have a full list of everyone in the department and what their associated email address is, right? So that's going to make targeting of future attacks even easier. And again, I mentioned Paul Schneckenberg earlier in this episode. Paul and I were talking about this 60,000 number a couple of days ago, actually. And I can't believe that the threat actors went to all this trouble and only exfiltrated 60,000 emails. I can't believe that's the limit of the blast radius at this point. It's got to be more than that. And I think, and this is one of my predictions for this month, is that we're going to continue to see a trickle of information. I don't think we've heard the last of this. Any thoughts, Umut?
Yeah, I believe so too, that we may see more information on this going forward. However, I believe that lots of events will happen behind the curtain, given that nation-state actors are behind the attack. Right. So we may not see all the details. And as you mentioned, so the mailing addresses got leaked too, right? So people know who is more or less on working on critical systems, in critical departments and so on. This can be used for subsequent attacks, for phishing attacks, for social engineering attacks. And if we take it one step further, for blackmailing even, to get into these critical systems. Right. Things like this also happen in a different context with VirusTotal some weeks ago. If you remember, VirusTotal accidentally leaked some usernames, including those of CIA members, right? So Secret Service members and so on. So people could actually see actual Secret Service agent names within the leak and so on. And I would say this is the same level of criticality.
Right. And I mean, it's these types of attacks that they take that information and pair it with other known information on the web, and it helps them complete that full persona of the target user, right? Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. And I know it's actively being investigated by the Department of Homeland Security Cyber Security Review Board. It's going to be interesting to see what comes of that, because I know in one of their recent announcements, they said that not only are they investigating this attack specifically, but they are now looking at the policies and procedures around the government's general consumption of cloud services, right? And whether that's going to... I don't think that's going to get them to a place where they say, hey, the government needs to pull out of cloud services 100%. I don't think that's going to happen, right? They're too invested at this point. But I think it may make some policy changes. It may require some changes from the cloud vendors to continue to service the government entities, right? But it's going to be an interesting place for the next couple of months to see what happens there.
Yeah. What we also have to keep in mind is that 60,000 emails got leaked. What we haven't heard about are the files in OneDrive and SharePoint and so on. So Microsoft has a huge cloud offering in that regard. So we will get to hear about that in the coming weeks.
Yep, exactly. So, well, our last item on the list is probably a vulnerability that in some way, shape, or form affects every person on the planet. And that is the libwebp library vulnerability. Libwebp, if you're not familiar, is a library that encodes and decodes WebP images out on the web, right? So with that in mind, every single web browser out there uses it. Every single one. And what's interesting about this is it started as just a Chrome vulnerability that Google announced initially, to which researchers in the security space were like, wait, what? That's a little strange. It's a libwebp issue, not a Chrome issue. Excuse me. And I think the big thing here is just the reach of the vulnerability. Not only did it have a CVSS score of 8.8, there were active exploits happening in the wild, but it had also been tied back to a reported Apple iOS, Mac OS breach a few weeks ago, I believe it was, where the NSO group had an exploit from their notorious, I'll say, Pegasus malware called BlastPass. And I don't think it's been confirmed yet, but there's a lot of security researchers that highly suspect that BlastPass exploit was essentially taking advantage of this same issue, just specifically on iOS and Mac OS devices, right? So the point being, it's a far-reaching issue, and not only is it web browsers, it's also any application that depends on Electron. So instantly I'm thinking Microsoft Teams. So people need to get patches applied, like ASAP, because this is a bad one. Did I miss anything there, Yumu?
No, I just want to emphasize to patch your software ASAP, as you mentioned. This vulnerability is exploited already actively. Because of that, it's really highly recommended to go after that if you haven't done yet. To name a few browsers, Chrome is affected, Firefox, Microsoft Edge, the Opera browser, everything based on Chromium, meaning also Brave and other browsers. The new Arc browser also. This is a wide-reaching zero-day vulnerability that needs to be fixed. And I believe Google has been investigating this thoroughly because from a historic context, they introduced the WebP image format in 2010, I believe, and the first stable library got released a few years ago in 2018. So it's a relatively new image format that comes with its own flaws, obviously.
Right.
And in the past, we have also seen this with other image formats. Now it's basically a déjà vu with the WebP format.
Right. Yep. It's not very often do we see a vulnerability that has as far a reach as this one. Excuse me. So it was definitely worth a mention. So, well, with that, Umut, I think we're at time for our episode. Any last minute item you want to mention before we wrap this up?
I think we talked about a lot of relevant data points already, gave guidance.
We did.
Yeah, I think we are all good.
We did. Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, thank you for being here, my friend. We always enjoy having you. So I'm sure we'll see you next month for this report, if not before, on some other topic. We recently just did that certifications episode. So that was a fun one and seems to be being well received thus far as well. So anyway, those of you watching, thanks for spending some time with us today. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We're available out on YouTube and all the major podcasting platforms, so you can find us on your platform of choice. Other than that, stay safe out there. Hope to see you again. And yeah, stay safe out there. Have a good one.